Good afternoon. Hello, Henry. Hi, Richard. Well, thanks for sharing your valuable time with me this afternoon here. Many years ago, I set up a little podcast, and it wasn't a podcast that went anywhere really, other than me recording some conversations on my mobile phone. But I would like to say I was ahead of our time, and that was what the podcast was called. And it was just me recording conversations with head teachers and having conversations with the two of you on separate topics over the past few years made me realise it's something we need to get back to. So you have to apologise for our clickbait title of Schools in Crisis. But in the last 25 years, I've not known it as tough as it is. Some of the big challenges that head teachers like Richard are facing. Hopefully this webinar will help to develop some of those solutions. As founder and managing director of Evolve, I have the pleasure of choosing who I work with. And I can honestly say that working with you guys has been an absolute joy, partly because I respect the work that you both do, but also I enjoy working with you. And it's great to introduce you on this webinar here for the first time. And let's try and have one of those conversations that we have and ideas spark off, and hopefully it will lead to something. So before we get started with the conversation, you all do a much better job than me at just briefly introducing yourself. So Henry, can I ask you to kick things off for us first?
Yeah, good afternoon, and it's an absolute pleasure being here. I echo every sentiment that you've issued there, John, and I can't do anywhere near as articulately, so I'll just proceed with giving a short synopsis on myself. My name's Henry Anafi. I have very recently started my own enterprise called Anafi Catalyst Solution Limited, and what we do is we provide visionary keynote speaking, I like to think, with a focus on ESG integration, that's environment, social and governance integration, helping businesses to become more effective at utilizing that and tapping into things that we're going to talk about, like the Social Value Act and the Procurement Act of 2023. In addition to that, I worked extensively on DEI initiatives for almost 30 years in the field of education, formerly working in the Department for Education and skills councils and 14 to 19 borough partnership management, and also providing lots of support to schools, helping them navigate Gatsby off of the back of my long-standing interventions in careers, information advice and guidance. So in a very small but messy nutshell, that's me.
Thanks, Henry. And Richard?
Hi, John. Nice to see you. And nice to meet you, Henry. First time we met properly, so lovely to meet you. My name's Richard. I've been working in Barking Dagenham for my 20th year now, and I've been head teacher at Greatfields for the last 9 years. So I'm incredibly passionate about our area and our local community and the challenges that our young people face. And I very strongly believe in the power of education to sort of change our young people's lives. I think that's going to be a crux of our conversation this afternoon. But yeah, I am very passionate about this subject and looking forward to having a robust conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Now, I referred earlier to schools being in crisis and mentioned that it was a pretty challenging time, but I'm not on the coalface. I'm fortunate that I get to spend time in schools, but Richard, having spent time in your great school, Greatfields, you obviously see and witness this firsthand every day. So for some viewers and listeners who aren't on the front line and aren't quite aware of some of these challenges, can you just give us a high-level overview of how things have changed in recent years and some of the day-to-day challenges you face there as a head teacher?
Yeah, I want to refute a little bit the title "Schools in Crisis." I think it's a little bit careful we don't talk down the sector. Every time you see education in the newspaper, there's always a very negative headline. I think there's lots of great things that happen in schools. I think it's really important that we celebrate that as well. It is challenging at the moment. It's kind of a perfect storm, and a lot of what schools are facing is kind of reflected in wider society. So two or three of the biggest challenges we face: a lack of funding, or certainly a slowing of funding, an increase in the level of needs of students coming through. And we have not enough resource to support those students as we'd like to. And then thirdly is kind of the challenge of recruiting staff. And we have some great staff, but it's definitely more of a challenging landscape than it was 10 years ago when you get into interview processes and sometimes kind of the quality and calibre of the fields. We've been very lucky, actually. We've recruited very well over the last 10 years, but I know it's a challenge. So you kind of got that perfect storm of funding being tight, increasing level of need of students coming through, and just I suppose teaching is a far less attractive profession than it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, especially with COVID and kind of you're now competing against kind of graduate schemes which offer hybrid working from home, and that kind of challenge of flexible working is something we're grappling with. I think fundamentally teaching is still a great job, and I think it's really important we talk it up in this podcast, because there are very few jobs out there that will give you such satisfaction, where you have such an impact on society.
Great. Thanks, Richard. And Just in terms of the increased level of needs, because this is the sort of work that my organisation Evolve has been doing over those years. And we used to have a caseload, and it was sometimes difficult to fill in certain schools. And we ended up working with lots of children who would have been given the gifted and talented title. But now we're finding that there's not enough hours in the day. Caseloads are much bigger than they used to be. So is there a summary you can provide just of some of those needs that some of the children are presenting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's I can talk for the local area. If I think about how the population's increased over the last 20 years or so in Bark and Dagenham, potentially you could argue this specialist provision has not grown in line with that increase in population. So what you have is a growing population with the same amount of specialist provision that was available 10 or 15 years ago. And by default, as your population increases, your percentage of your number of needs are going to increase with that. I also think COVID is a really relevant conversation here as well. And it's something we're really still seeing kind of the fallout from COVID. And I think the impact that COVID had on our young people at primary school and kind of early years, we're now starting to see come through secondary school. Lack of school readiness and just the lack of basic social skills in some cases. So I think it's a double effect of increase in our area, certainly increasing local population, which is great. We've had 4 new schools built in the last 10 years to absorb that, not necessarily meeting in line with the number of specialist provision places available. But also just, I think, the challenges of COVID and kind of those lost years, really starting to see those come through the secondary sector. I think these are challenges the primary sector probably been playing with for the last few years. We're now starting to see them come through secondary over the last 2 or 3 years as well now.
Thank you for that. Really, really important and insightful. But Henry, from your perspective, I know you've got your parents' hat, former Department for Education LSC hat, and more recently developer of education solutions for businesses. Do you think schools are in crisis, or do you think that this is just a blip and schools will continue to do what they've always done, which is serve the needs of their local community with the resources available?
No, thanks. It's such an important question. I was really interested to get Richard's perspective from the coalface, because I'm sure he can attest more acutely than any of us that it's an ever-changing dynamic. As much as things are very, very different, they still remain the same. And having left the sort of education funding side of the fence formally in 2013, it is somewhat dispiriting to see how significant the challenges are that are facing the education system. Particularly when I look at things like teacher recruitment, I still have a lot of friends in the industry. And with particular areas such as SEND support, I remember saying that hiring teachers is a bit like finding unicorns who can also mark homework. It's an impossible task, and as Richard's pointed out, the attraction does not seem to be what it was to enter into the profession. So I do think that teacher recruitment and SEND support in particular is quite a significant challenge. I also think that, mental health is something that's become a ubiquitous phrase and is possibly overused in a lot of parts. But I do think that mental health and behaviour is something that is impacting schools like never before, particularly post the pandemic. And so when you consider that student mental health referrals have skyrocketed, I think that they're up by something like 73 to 76%, I believe it was, since 2019. That leaves schools essentially paying therapists whilst trying to teach Pythagoras. I can't imagine how challenging that must be. So I do think that there are opportunities to try and encourage more businesses to look at ways in which they can provide supporting mechanisms that hopefully can alleviate some of the challenges that schools are facing. And I'm sure we're going to discuss that going forward.
Yeah, I think picking up the point of SEND, we have an incredibly strong inclusion team, but my frustration is having to say no to my SENCO when she asked me for additional members of staff to work in that team because budgets are so tight. So the calibre is there, actually. It's just the sort of limitations of the budget, meaning you can't necessarily employ the number of staff you would want to in order to support the needs of those students. So the talent is there, no question about it, and our school is testimony to that. But it is frustrating. I know I could probably employ 2 or 3 additional people in that department to really support those needs, and just knowing that the budgets just aren't there, which I think where the conversation around social value acts and where funding can come through from different, perhaps we need to be much more agile in terms of looking for different funding opportunities, such as the project I know we'll talk about later, John, where if there's funding coming from business to support some of this specialist work, that make a huge difference in terms of the work and impact we can have on our young people.
Well, I know the title of this webinar might be doom and gloom, but the second part to it was why it's every business's business, and we've come onto that now because there's a new factor at play, which is encouraging certainly the larger corporate businesses to get involved in not just educational initiatives, but anything within society. And I know, Henry, we've spent a lot of time over the years now talking initially about the Social Value Act, which has been on the scene for some time, but it was only the recent PPN, the Public Procurement Notice, which gave it a little bit more teeth. But it's the introduction of the Procurement Act, which came into effect this year, that's really going to give that some legs for head teachers like Richard to do something useful with. So for viewers who are unfamiliar with these government legislations, can you just give us a top-level overview of what the Social Value Act and the Procurement Act are?
Yeah, I was afraid you'd say that. So trying to distill very wordy government documents into something pithy is always a bit of a challenge. But as you mentioned, the Social Value Act's been around for about just over a decade now. Essentially, it mandates that businesses delivering public sector contracts or public sector works demonstrate some form of measurable social impact. And a classic example of that would be supporting education or reducing inequality, even to be top-line things that most people can gravitate to. So for organizations, it genuinely creates an opportunity to start addressing skills gaps, whilst also fulfilling their contractual obligations. I know we can sort of talk about examples as we're going forward, but Kia Group are a great example of the type of things and initiatives they're doing, integrating some of their corporate social responsibility and environment, social and governance priorities with school curriculum. So they've created integrated apprenticeships for care leavers into their bids, which was actually part and parcel of why they secured, I think it was 900 million or 1 billion HS2 contract whilst building a skilled workforce. You mentioned the public procurement notice. That's obviously stemming from the Procurement Act of 2023, which is about creating community-driven growth, essentially. So the Procurement Act requires all public sector contracts to prioritize social value, and with at least 10%, I think it's 10% of scoring tied to community impact. So the idea is that should shift the focus from cost to long-term societal benefits. Construction companies have tended to be at the sort of apex of this, but there are an increasing number of companies that recognize not just the contractual opportunities, but that frankly, it's a very effective way of trying to identify and secure a future customer base as well, as all the data and all the anecdotal evidence indicates quite clearly that millennials, Gen Z, and undoubtedly Generation Alpha believe in the principles that are espoused through the Social Value Act and public procurement in respect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is part and parcel of who they are, rather than the tick box exercise. So it behooves most organizations, but companies in particular, to start looking at this as the real growth opportunity, an engine for growth, as well as social cohesion that the Social Value Act and the Procurement Act afford us.
Thanks, Henry. And for me, I think it's worth adding as well that a few years ago, you had the big, let's say the national organisations, maybe international organisations with a UK footprint, who would run CSR initiatives in schools. So that was community social responsibility, corporate social responsibility programs. And the local businesses didn't really get involved in that space because they didn't possibly have the budget to do so. But with the Procurement Act now, it's central and local government contracts. So even local businesses that are intending to work with regional authorities, local authorities, the contractual obligation will be that they have to give something back to the local communities. And education, anything to do with children and young people, is well featured. And obviously schools are the ideal place to do that. So Richard, with all of this in mind, and going back to your point earlier about being agile and looking for funding from different sources, it's worth noting that this won't be long-term sustainable funding. It's project by project. So I know in Barking and Dagenham, for example, there was the Barking Riverside project, and Morgan Sindall was the contractor there, very heavily involved. And once that project's completed, their social value commitments generally come to an end. But if you were to have a project fund or an organisation like Kia Group that Henry mentioned, or Morgan Sindall, what would you like to do with that funding on a school basis that would really make a difference?
Question, John. Yeah, I think if I talk a little around the project we worked on over the last year or so together, it's a nice case study, I think, of where the funding could be used really valuably. And it kind of comes back to our conversations around how you referred to kind of students called mental health and increasing mental health needs. A big part of that is students transitioning from primary school to secondary school, and actually what a scary prospect that is for many of our young people, kind of the safety and security of a primary school to suddenly the sort of the huge sort of secondary schools they go into. So the projects I worked on with John over the last 12 months was to fund the school funded with 2 local primary schools, a mentor who worked with identified students in the 2 primary schools who find the transition particularly challenging from primary to secondary, worked with those students in their last term at primary school in year 6, built up those relationships with the students and their parents and families, brought them through a summer school over the summer transition period, and then remained with us for the next 2 terms with those students. So those students had a very familiar face for that first 6 months of transition. And that really supported those students in terms of just finding that transition that much easier because they had that familiar face coming through. It was an excellent project with some really good outcomes in terms of students' attendance compared to primary school, their behaviour, and started to see some improvements in academic outcomes. And unfortunately, we couldn't run it again this year due to lack of funding. We'd hoped we ran it as a pilot for a year, but not something the school could sustain. But that's a really good example of where if we had additional funding, we could really put that into good use and kind of to extend that where we would want the funding to be is really in setting up alternative provisions for our young. For those students that find mainstream is not a one size fits all, and I think what we need to be finding is innovative ways for students to be successful in mainstream away from the traditional model. So this mentoring program is a really good example of that. We've now set up a sort of transition group with a primary school specialist teaching our most vulnerable year 7 students for the first term, just to kind of ease their transition. Some of them are working at Key Stage 1 level and ease them into mainstream. But again, that's a very expensive model. So I would want to put the funding really, I think, at Key Stage 3 in particular, and support their students' transition. Finding models which are a bit more fluid and agile for those students that struggle to cope with the traditional mainstream model, because the special provision doesn't exist. So what mainstream school needs to be doing is have those provisions within our existing structures, but that's as they are expensive models. And if there's funding available, I think there's a lot to be said for running those projects within school to use the funding to fund those.
Richard, I think what you said there, something you said in one of your earlier responses about being agile, and that's something I'm taking away from this conversation already, because with many friends who are head teachers and looking at the high needs block funding, for example, balancing the books and managing budgets, reporting to governing body, it's generally on an annual basis or a 3-year cycle, for example. But when we think about project funding, which is what the Social Value Act and Procurement Act will hopefully deliver for us, it is thinking slightly differently. The example that you gave there is a good one because that transition between year 6 and year 7, it's one of those where it falls between responsibility areas. Yes, we're all interested in the development of children and young people, of course we are. But from a funding perspective, primary school head teacher will say, well, our work here is done. They've had their SATs exam, they've finished their time with us. We need to invest our limited resources on pupils who we're currently supporting, not after they've left us. And equally, it's similar stories for secondary schools, because when you receive them in September, that's when your work technically starts, but you know that doing some work before then would make a big difference. So that's an example, not just of an effective project, but I think it's also an effective use of the funding, because anything that you do at that stage will potentially benefit those children and young people, not just their time with you in secondary education, but then beyond secondary education as well. So I think that's where the word innovation is used quite often, but identifying, I'll throw another analogy in here, the tip of the spear, something that can be short and impactful, but it doesn't necessarily involve long-term funding. And again, going back to the summer holiday example, that's one of the areas where the local youth justice teams have real concerns, because that's when criminality and gang exploitation can be exposed. And Henry, you've got some experiences, certainly with your work previously in the justice sector, where you've developed some innovative projects that maybe lead to sustainable funding from prisons or from other funding organisations who may not have a commitment to innovation or have the ability to innovate, but maybe some project funding through the Social Value Act could allow that innovation to happen. And if it does succeed, somebody else could pick up the tab on a sustainability basis. So have you got any examples from your wider experience there, Henry, in the criminal justice sector?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because interestingly enough, and just sort of picking up from what both yourself and Richard have commented on, is that in some respects we have to almost give the Procurement Act a little room to breathe, because people are still starting to familiarise themselves with it and to navigate it. And as you'll both know, whenever it comes to any sort of central government funding, getting access and, for that matter, an understanding of it can be a bit like turning around the Titanic. What I think is a real opportunity here is that building long-term partnerships via the Procurement Act is ingrained within the tenets of the Procurement Act, and it incentivizes sustained partnerships between businesses and schools so that they move beyond these one-off corporate social responsibility or CSR projects. Great examples, Jaguar Land Rover, they had their, yes, it still exists, the Inspiring Tomorrow's Engineers program. And that's trained around about 10,000 students in robotics over 5 years. And that's increased their apprenticeships by around about 38% coming from partner schools. And those sorts of collaborations ensure that you've got a steady talent supply, but also ensure that the company meeting their Procurement Act criteria. There's also the need to maximize the impact through environment, social governance driven solutions. And the updated Procurement Act does allow businesses to embed ESG principles directly into their bids. Great example, which will probably be quite interesting to Richard, is Serco. They integrated school mental health programs into their proposal, and it's improved their bid successes by 20%. So for them, it's obviously a win-win, but addresses the student well-being. And that's a challenge that's cited by around about 3/4 of school leaders. And I think that was from the latest NHS survey in 2023. So when we're framing education initiatives as ESG priorities, then you've got companies that are able to attract socially conscious investors and customers. So that's on a broader macro scale. And I have various companies that I've been working with over the past sort of year and a half or so within the scaffolding sector specifically, who are recognizing the significant opportunity that exists in creating those direct relationships with schools. A mantra that I always repeat to our employers is that a large part of the future of employability is going to be about localization. And I do think that this gives schools an opportunity to utilize Gatsby benchmarks and form those relationships with local employers that a number of their students may not be aware of in terms of the kind of breadth of roles that exist on their doorstep logistically, as well as a sort of broad expanse of careers that may sit outside the traditional academic curriculum.
I think your point, Henry, around sustainability, the long-term relationships is so key. These kind of one-year funded projects aren't particularly helpful because you can't set anything up.
Indeed.
For a year's fund, and that will support or help 15, 20 students. What you want is a funding model whereby for the next 5 to 10 years, every year, 6, 7 transition has the guarantee, for example, of this project running. So these 1 year flash in the pan project funds are not overly helpful because you can't build up a sustainable model. The problems we're dealing with aren't going anywhere. The solution needs to come up with the need to be sustainable. So Henry's, your point about sustainability is key. This is about building long-term relationships between companies and schools whereby you can guarantee a sort of 10-year funding stream so you can really get stuck into these big issues. 1 year funding in itself is not particularly helpful. It's not something schools can continue funding once that funding's gone away from the companies.
You're spot on, Richard. And it's one of the reasons why I think that we can very often make a mistake in having a laser focus on these larger corporates. It's not to say that they are anything other than highly supportive, but the reality is that schools, by dint of their structures and their priorities, are community hubs in a lot of respects. It therefore means that relationships with local employers are going to be far more sustainable. And you will recognize, of course, that the local employer has a vested interest in ensuring the health and a pipeline of future talent into their employees. And we're just putting it really, really bluntly. So I am as enthused as I am and really excited about the prospect of these big companies that I brought to the table, like your Land Rovers and your Kias. It doesn't change the fact that for us to really make the significant kind of traction that we want, we have to get more of the local employers understanding the benefits of these school partnerships, not least of which is because the social cohesion aspect, which we all care about, is a real bugbear for all of us to try and find some sort of meaningful solutions. And I do think that local employer intervention is absolutely fundamental to the success of what we're trying to achieve. And also, I genuinely believe that the students get significant benefit from having employers that have a degree of relatability above and beyond the kind of conventional careers advice that I had way back in the day, far too far back in the day for us to even sort of, even consider it to be particularly relevant. I look at the way in which careers has historically been delivered and how schools are trying to navigate that now. And you're essentially operating with one arm behind your back, trying to make it impartial and informative, whilst at the same time looking at how you have to tick all the sort of Gatsby requirements as well. So we can get employers who are more conversant with the process and the system, recognizing the opportunities they can capitalize on. They can at least meet you halfway and not have you sort of doing so much of that legwork, which is part and parcel of the work that I do as well through my company now.
I must admit, I get very frustrated when I see companies on LinkedIn post these well-intentioned programs or school assembly ideas, and I'm just thinking to myself, if all of that energy could be channeled in the right way, and the concepts that we're talking about here of forming long-term partnerships with local employers and also those national employers or local footprints, I think there's something to be said here about it being relational rather than transactional. And I think that school assembly thing ticks a box to basically say we've done what we said we're going to do, but the impact is negligible. And for the school, it might have detracted from what they could have done, spending that management time doing something else. So I would certainly recommend any businesses out there, and especially now they're employing more and more social value managers, to work on a relationship basis to try and form these conversations, start these conversations with head teachers like Richard, and just identify what those local challenges are. I think that would be the first suggestion from my side. And then the other one, Richard, I'm going to come back to you here because there's an interesting conversation I had with the team in the procurement team in Barking and Dagenham. When they were putting some bids together, they were using fairly common and generic documentation, but it wasn't localized to the extent of meeting the needs of Barking and Dagenham children and young people. So within the local authority, we've got very, very strong people I know in Barking and Dagenham who you've introduced me to, who are committed to doing some of this work on a longer term basis, but they don't have that innovation funding. They don't have the ability or the resources to place a bet on something that might not work. But if there was a connection between the procurement team within the local authority and the education team within the local authority, there might be some cohesion there. So who are the best, and this is probably taking off your head teacher's hat now, and you're talking from a broader perspective with your secondary network lead hat on. Who would you suggest are the best people within local authorities for companies to engage with? And we're not talking the commissioning team here, it's people who you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in regards to education.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Also, the landscape within local authorities has changed significantly, and with the sort of number of MATs and academies, there's not necessarily that local authority structure that was there 10 years ago. Even that itself kind of needs to be rethought, and whether you're engaging directly with MATs, and the central team of MATs potentially is going to be more powerful. Because local authorities' funding is tight, not all schools buy into the local authorities now. I mean, Barking and Dagenham still has a pretty strong local authority presence, but other local authorities have been quite weakened, especially the number of MATs coming in. So I wonder if it's also engagement between sort of multi-academy trusts and the procurement teams and kind of talking directly there. But I suppose sort of in a local context, it's working. We've worked kind of with the sort of inclusion team in the local authority, and that's where the money sent in the local authority, the inclusion team. That's where the money's needed. That's where the initiative work can happen. Bang against the wall, trying to kind of look for different provisions, different kind of options, and there's just no money available for those. But it comes back to sustainability. I want to fund £100,000 for a year is no good because you can't sustain a new setting on that. That needs to be a sustainable funding model. But I think heads also, we need to be more proactive. I'm including myself as we're sort of talking. It makes me think how I need to be much more proactive in going out and looking for these opportunities and links and kind of not just wait for them to come to us. So our relationship jobs would be great and making me think more outwardly. I think head teachers we're not business people, we know education, but we probably do need to be thinking a lot more outwardly in terms of how we can form these relationships with both local and national employers. I think the national side is important in terms of aspiration for our young people, not just staying local, but actually looking at what life outside of Barking and Dagenham looks like. So I think heads need to be more proactive. I think MATs play a big part in this actually. The landscape's changed a lot, and I think maybe sort of the engagement of MATs with these teams also is going to be important moving forward.
I think this is the reason why we are seeing so many school assemblies and schemes of work and resources dropped into schools. It's because it's difficult to create and curate a program, a scheme of work, something that really does make a difference I know that a lot of social value managers are a really vibrant group. I've been to lots of their networking events, and they're really committed to making a difference. But equally, they're not teachers. They've not worked in a school setting before. So it's how we can create these solutions together that I think will make the biggest difference, because otherwise we are just ticking boxes and wasting funds that could be put towards public delivery reform. So Henry, I know you're much closer to businesses than I am. What would you say to businesses who are looking to really do some good work, impactful work that moves beyond a tick box and scoring some social value points? Based on what Richard said and conversation today, how would you recommend that businesses move forward here if they really want to do something that makes a difference?
Well, the obvious answer to that is they should speak to me. But of course, looking at this in terms of practical, actionable steps, we've mentioned building long-term partnerships, but of course, they have to be curriculum aligned partnerships. That can be challenging for some businesses, but I know that with the kind of progressive leadership that you have in schools now, with heads like Richard, that is not the sort of blockage that historically it has been, and businesses should not necessarily be afraid of seeking to create those partnerships. And there's one company who I used to work with in my former life as the training manager for a scaffolding trade body, one of the largest scaffolding firms in the country, All Task Limited. Got an amazing head of training there who recognized that in order to be able to capitalize on some of the opportunities we talked about, that he needed to just do a little bit more than the school assemblies. So he actually went and asked what the challenges were that the school had and how he could potentially help to solve them. You know, frankly, I suppose it's one of those approaches that's selling without being, having people feel like they're being sold to, because he was looking to create a collaborative solution for the school, whilst at the same time recognizing that in developing those pathways and creating relationships of trust and building relationships with some of the students over years, it was highly likely to create a favorable impression amongst the student body as well as the school. And I'm pleased to say that in the Kent area, where Rochester, where their main depot is based, they have now got a steady pipeline of students who are actively applying for roles without it even necessitating any school visits from yourself. And that's been on the basis of 3 or 4 years of direct, proactive engagement with the school. Now, social value managers from non-education sectors do often struggle to align initiatives with school needs. And this is another reason why I'm emphasizing sustained partnerships to integrate business expertise into the curriculum. I know BP have got a pretty established program of STEM ambassadors, for example, and that partners engineers with schools long-term, co-designing projects like renewable energy challenges and the like. But of course, that's something that BP are potentially well resourced to do. But if a school takes the lead, there's nothing that prohibits you from sort of getting, I don't know, your local hire and sales shop to create some sort of bespoke project with a local focus that gets your students invested because they can see the local benefits, as well as raising the sort of profile of the opportunities that businesses have to integrate and work more collaboratively with schools. So I think that aligning those initiatives with Gatsby benchmarks, and I think from the school's point of view, recognizing that there may be some challenging conversations about how to prepare people for the world of work. There is an increasing movement from lots of employers now to start recruiting people on the basis of resilience rather than CVs. And I get it, because in this day and age of AI bots and the like, CVs can look as glorious as your imagination allows them to be. I put one together for myself the other day and I actually asked myself as to whether that was me that I was actually looking at when I looked at the finished product. So with all of these uncomfortable realities that I think are facing all of us as societies, but certainly from the point of view of educators, there does need to be a review, I believe, of the way in which students are prepared to navigate very simple, I say simple, but straightforward traditional processes such as interviews and the kinds of things that employers are going to be looking for. That will also necessitate a little bit more forensic analysis as to what the kind of direction of travel is within specific sectors, but it is undoubtedly the case that employers are looking at more criteria, so a broader range of criteria to assess potential employees than just sort of CVs, which is far too often the way in which anyone entering the workplace is educated to try and navigate it.
I think that employability piece is really, really important, because even though the traditional modern work experience now is very hard to sustain, because trying to find placements now is increasingly hard, and actually the value of trying to find really valuable work experience placements is very, very hard. So it's trying to move away from that traditional modern work experience in year 10 and year 12 and have it as a more ongoing piece of work relationship with employees all the way through the school career, rather than this kind of artificial time in year 10 and 12 where you go off for 2 weeks and go and work at McDonald's, or sometimes you get these fantastic placements up in the city, but that model no longer really works, and it's harder to find placements now. I think you used the word bespoke a few times, and you're absolutely right. And kind of the concept to sit down with a local business, having that conversation would be really exciting, because there's no one answer to your question, John, around what are we looking for. I think it's having those conversations in the room with people, saying, right, let's get a blank piece of paper. What can we do together? And I think then you've got so many exciting possibilities. I don't think there is a single answer to that question. And I think conversations like this are just exciting because you start thinking what the possibilities. It's sitting down with those local employees, saying, right, what do we need? What can you do? What can we put together which is sustainable and will really benefit our students to become, as you say, because the whole game of this area is a student area like ours, and to make our students as employable as possible, give them the best possible chances. And anything we can do outside of the classroom to do that and work with local businesses is going to be so important.
And you know what? I'm reminded of what both my sons say whenever they realize I'm going to have a conversation of this nature, or whenever I talk about education quite generally, that we shouldn't forget that education should, if at all possible, be enjoyed. And there are a number of students who do enjoy learning particular subjects. I don't want to just say for the sake of learning, but because they have a passion for that particular subject without necessarily considering it to be a career proposition. And I know that must be particularly challenging for you as well. But one of the things that I've been discussing with Kingfisher, actually, very recently, who are a large sort of corporate, is ways in which they can become more invested in creating these sort of bespoke projects that aren't focused necessarily on identifying the next coder, or the next head of HR or sales, but just give students who have a particular proclivity or talent in an area the opportunity to sort of thrive and excel by creating these extracurricular programs, if you like. And the reality is that FOMO within businesses is a real thing, and the more businesses that we get working collaboratively with educators and with schools in particular, then I think we have a means to leverage greater support from the business community when they recognize the art of what's possible, not just purely and simply because it ticks an ESG or a CSR box, but because there are meaningful, tangible benefits that are afforded to the students, to the school, and that helps not just with the social cohesion aspect, but also in developing that future talent pipeline. Every single one of the 15 sectors is saying we desperately need to address.
I think most students, I'm going back to my point right at the beginning about schools in Christ. I think most students do enjoy coming to school, and I think that's a great thing. I think students do enjoy those subjects. I think they do. Learning, the sake of learning, is really valuable, because what other point in your life do you get just to sit down and learn stuff? And I think actually that there's a real value there. And kids, I would say this to our community: school is the safest place for our students, and the vast majority of our students love coming to school every day, not just for the social interactions, but for the opportunities in the classroom, for the learning. So I think the career piece and the work in the business is a part of that. But I think we've really got to be careful. We're not talking down schools and students' views of school. I think kids do love school, and I think they love learning. I think they find my daughter, who's 6 years old, has come back and these fascinating facts. She loves this learning. Where's the Eiffel Tower? What's the capital of France? Kids love this. And I think that we mustn't ever lose sight of that's a core purpose of education, as well as all of these employability pieces we're talking about.
Yeah, I can echo that, in as much as my oldest is, I feel like he's going back and doing a school assembly every other month. Frankly, I couldn't convince you to go to school this often when you were in school. I can't keep you away from it. So you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, negative news is what seems to sell. So we don't hear about all the amazing things that have been done by so many schools. And for me, and I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but we never hear about all of the fantastic young people that we have. doing amazing things. And this is in spite of everything rather than because of any one thing. So like you, this is an opportunity, hopefully, to talk them up and recognize that we all want to do better by them, because there are so many of them that are going to do some incredible things to help change our world for the better. And I really concur with your sentiment.
Guys, we could probably talk for much longer on. I know we could talk for much longer on this, but we're almost at time. I think this conversation that we've had, bringing two worlds together, the world of Greatfields and Richard and Henry and your background and all the different projects you've been involved in. It just shows the positivity and the opportunities that happen when two worlds collide and evolve as an organization. I would love to take credit for this, but I can't. We started out doing a thing, and it helped to link the health system with the education system. Now we're doing a little bit of that with the justice system as well. And more recently, it's with businesses. And I think when we start breaking down those silos, really magical things start happening there. Just in terms of closing remarks, I've got a couple, but Henry, anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I mean, there are so many things that are pertinent to this conversation. But I suppose if there was one thing that I would probably emphasize, is it's about transforming the school infrastructure for community resilience to a certain extent. A classroom today is essentially the local communities tomorrow. It's therefore incumbent, I think, on that classic axiom that we hear so often: it takes a village. But in acknowledging that it takes a village, I think we also need to recognize that there is more of a collective responsibility for each of us being participative in that community to ensure that we can do our best to support schools and businesses in synchronizing activity a little bit more for the benefit of all of us. So, crafting ESG strategies that frame infrastructure projects as dual wins, and that's a job of work to do for corporates. And the call to action is, let's just rebuild some of the crumbling infrastructure within our schools, support our teachers with some of these more flexible funding pots that are available, so that we can ensure that the next construction contract leaves a legacy of learning, not just bricks and mortar. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Thank you, Henry. And Richard, any closing remarks?
I do come back to the fact I think schools are not as bad a place as it's kind of spoken about publicly. There are challenges, definitely. But these conversations are really important, because I think schools need to be far more proactive in their leadership role within the community. It's something we've talked a lot about recently, about being taking more of a leadership role within the community and starting to bring people and businesses together. So that's something I'm taking away from this meeting. I've written down several guises just now: be more proactive, start looking for those links to local businesses, because I think we need to be more agile and more creative with our funding streams and kind of providing opportunities for our young people.
Well, I think you've stolen something I was going to add here at the end, Richard, because I go to numerous events, education and business events, but very rarely do I see teachers at business events and business people at teaching events. And when I do, what generally happens is they come to do a keynote and they go. My recommendation would be for head teachers to find a social value event to go to. And there are plenty, and they would be inundated. And equally, I would love social value managers to go along and find the local education conference. Every region will have a local education conference. The virtual schools host them, not just for care experienced young people, but for anybody as part of their wider remit now for children with a social worker. So to get a business along to that and get them represented just in a learning capacity, not to talk, but just to learn, I think that would be a good step forward. And also in terms of forging these links, the good thing about the Social Value Act is that it's created a new professional workforce called social value managers. So they're very easy people to find on LinkedIn. So if there's a project that you hear about in your local area, just go onto LinkedIn and find out who the social value manager is for that project and have a conversation, because I think things will start happening when those silos are broken. So I must bring things to a close, because I need to be sensitive of your time. You've given up a lot of your own time this afternoon to join in this conversation. So thanks to both of you. It's been a really enjoyable conversation, lots of food for thought from my side. And I'll be sharing Richard and Henry's contact details in the notes for the webinar if you would like to make contact with either of them directly. And I'm really looking forward to continuing these conversations with you both individually and hopefully together on a joint project in some time in the future. Thanks again for joining today, and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, John.